These mass executions served strategic purposes that went beyond simple revenge. They were intended to break the will of the entire population, so that resistance would seem not only futile but counterproductive. The message was clear. Rebellion would lead not only to defeat, but to such suffering that death would be a liberation rather than a tragedy. The psychological aspect of these spectacles cannot be overestimated. The Romans understood that fear of crucifixion could be more effective than the execution itself. By creating spectacular examples of what awaited those who dared to challenge Roman authority, they could deter future uprisings at relatively little cost. A few thousand executions could influence the behavior of millions of people throughout the empire. Economic considerations were also significant. Crucifixion was a relatively inexpensive method of mass execution. Unlike other forms of capital punishment, which required expensive equipment or skilled executioners, crucifixion could be carried out by ordinary soldiers with simple tools. Crosses could be reused, and the only significant costs were the nails and the labor required to erect them. The influence of the Roman practice of crucifixion extended far beyond its immediate political and military purposes. It shaped cultural attitudes towards suffering, justice, and state power that influenced Western civilization for centuries. The association of crucifixion with the lower classes of society had profound consequences for early Christianity. When the Romans crucified Jesus of Nazareth, they made a statement about his social status and the threat he posed to their power. The fact that early Christians turned this symbol of shame into a symbol of triumph represents one of the most remarkable reversals in cultural history. Detailed Roman descriptions of the crucifixion procedure also served as a model that influenced execution practices throughout Europe for centuries. Even when crucifixion itself fell out of use, the Roman emphasis on publicity, humiliation, and the length of the punishment continued to influence society's attitude toward capital punishment. The literary and artistic legacy of Roman crucifixion practices was no less significant. Writers from Tacitus to contemporary novelists have used vivid images of Roman mass crucifixions to explore themes of power, resistance, and human suffering. The image of the Appian Way lined with crosses became a standard metaphor for systematic oppression and state terror. But perhaps the most important legacy of Roman crucifixion practices was that they demonstrated how states could use spectacular violence to maintain social control. The techniques developed by the Romans, public executions designed to maximize psychological impact, systematic humiliation of victims, and the use of prolonged suffering as a deterrent, were refined and applied by authoritarian governments throughout history. The Roman practice of crucifixion is a disturbing mirror in which we can see both ancient and modern attitudes toward justice, power, and human dignity. It shows a society that was advanced enough to build roads that lasted for millennia and create a legal system that still influences modern law, yet was willing to torture people to death for public entertainment. But before we congratulate ourselves on our moral progress, we must remember that the Romans considered themselves a civilized people, bringing order to a chaotic world. They believed that their harsh punishments were justified by good intentions, that their spectacular displays of violence were necessary to maintain a peace that allowed trade, art, and science to flourish. Crucifixions along the Appian Way were not an aberration or an exception to Roman civilization. They were an integral part of it. They were the foundation upon which the Roman world was built, a visible reminder of what awaited those who dared to challenge the established order. They were both the price of empire and its most enduring symbol. Studying these ancient customs forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own society. What forms of systematic violence do we accept in the name of order and security? What spectacles of suffering do we create or tolerate in order to preserve our version of civilization? How do we balance the demands of justice with the demands of human dignity? The crosses have long since rotted away, and it is tourists, not crucified rebels, who now travel along the Appian Way. But the questions raised by these ancient executions remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. In the end, perhaps this is the most important lesson the Romans can teach us: that the capacity for great civilization and great cruelty exists within the same society, within the same institutions, and even within the same people. The echoes of those ancient hammers driving nails into human flesh still reverberate in our modern world. They remind us that progress is not inevitable, that civilization is fragile, and that the price of human dignity is eternal vigilance against those who are willing to sacrifice it for order, security, or power. What do you think about this deep dive into one of the darkest pages of history? The Romans' use of crucifixion says so much about power, society, and human nature that it is impossible to cover it all in one article. If you enjoyed this research and would like to see more content on the most brutal practices of ancient history, subscribe and let me know in the comments what other dark corners of the past you would like me to shed light on. Your participation helps me continue to research and write about events that are often overlooked in mainstream history. What aspect of Roman crucifixion struck you the most? Spartacus did the unthinkable. Share your thoughts below. He turned the very foundation of Rome, its huge slave population, into an army of liberators. For 3 years, from 73 to 71 BC, his forces not only survived but thrived, defeating Roman legions and growing from a small band of escaped gladiators into an army of more than 100,000 rebels. They ravaged southern Italy, striking fear into the hearts of the Roman elite, and demonstrating that the slaves of the empire were not the submissive property their masters believed them to be. The threat Spartacus posed went beyond purely military considerations. He embodied an existential challenge to the Roman way of life, which depended entirely on the labor of millions of slaves. If slaves could successfully revolt, if they could defeat Roman troops and threaten Roman cities, then the entire social order was at risk. The response had to be commensurate with the threat, not just military defeat, but the complete demoralization of any future rebels. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest and most ambitious politicians, finally cornered Spartacus and defeated him in 71 BC. But victory in battle was only the beginning. From among the survivors captured after the final battle, Crassus selected about 6,000 men who were destined to meet a fate that would echo through history. They were crucified along the Appian Way, Rome's greatest road, turning a vital artery of trade and communication into a corridor of corpses. The logistics of this mass execution were staggering. 6,000 crosses required an enormous amount of wood, iron, and skilled labor. Hundreds of trees would have been needed for the vertical posts alone, and thousands more for the horizontal beams. Blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge nails, at least 3 for each victim, and often more. Teams of executioners, guards, and laborers were organized to systematically torture and execute thousands of people. But the true genius of Crassus's plan lay not in its scale, but in its location. The Appian Way was not chosen by chance. It was Rome's most important road, the main artery connecting the capital with the rich ports of southern Italy. Every merchant, every official, every traveler who had business in the south had to pass through this strip of human suffering. The road that once symbolized Rome's engineering prowess now bore witness to its cruelty. Crucified rebels were placed at regular intervals along the road, creating a terrifying gallery stretching 200 kilometers from Rome to Capua. Every few hundred meters, travelers encountered a new cross, with dying or already dead bodies hanging from it. The psychological effect was staggering. There was no escape from this spectacle, no way to avoid the consequences of challenging Roman authority. The bodies were left hanging until they were completely decomposed, which could take months or even years, depending on weather conditions and the activity of scavengers. This was not just a practical solution, but also a symbolic one. The rebels had challenged the eternity of Roman rule, so their punishment had to be eternal, or at least as close to eternity as the human mind could imagine. Crucifixion was never a private affair. These executions were carefully staged public spectacles designed to maximize the psychological impact on the living. The Romans understood what modern governments often forget. The power of punishment lies not only in its severity, but also in its visibility. Secret execution may satisfy justice, but only public execution can serve the broader goals of social control and political propaganda. The typical place of crucifixion was outside the city walls, but within walking distance of large population centers. This location was not chosen at random, close enough for citizens to know what was happening and to be able to attend easily if they wished, but far enough away that the city itself was not defiled by the uncleanliness of death. The sites were usually chosen on hills or high ground, so that the crosses could be seen from a distance, and large crowds could gather unhindered. The timing of the executions was also carefully chosen. Major crucifixions were often scheduled for market days, holidays, or other events that attracted large crowds. The authorities wanted as many people as possible to witness their display of power and were willing to coordinate their actions with the public calendar to achieve this goal. The crowd that gathered for these spectacles represented a cross-section of Roman society, but the motives of its participants varied greatly. Some came out of morbid curiosity, drawn by the same impulses that today cause people to stare at accident sites. Others came for more practical reasons. Executioners traditionally distributed the belongings of the executed, and these could include valuable items. For the Roman authorities, these crowds served several purposes. They were witnesses to Roman justice and could spread information about what they saw among friends and relatives throughout the empire. They were also participants in the execution. Their presence lent legitimacy to the process and created a sense of collective responsibility for the punishment meted out. The condemned themselves became actors in this grim theater, though they had neither script nor choice in their performance. Some met their death with stoic courage, refusing to give their executioners the satisfaction of seeing them break. Others screamed and begged, providing the crowd with a spectacle of complete humiliation demanded by Roman justice. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, displaying the full range of human reactions to unimaginable suffering. The story of Julius Caesar and the Cilician pirates provides one of the most revealing insights into the Roman attitude toward crucifixion. It demonstrates how even apparent acts of mercy could be calculated to enhance, rather than mitigate, the cruelty of punishment. In 75 BC, the young Caesar was captured by pirates while traveling to Rhodes to study oratory. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of gold, a considerable sum reflecting Caesar's obvious wealth and status. Caesar's response was characteristically bold. He laughed at the pirates and told them they did not know who they had captured. 20 talents was an insult. They should have demanded at least 50. During his captivity, Caesar treated the pirates with a mixture of familiarity and contempt, which must have been both charming and unnerving. He joked with them, participated in their games, and even read poetry for their entertainment. But he also made them a promise, which they apparently took as another joke. When he was freed, he would return and crucify them all. Caesar kept his word. After the ransom was paid and he was freed, he immediately organized a fleet, tracked down the pirates, and captured the entire gang. True to his word, he ordered them all to be crucified. But then he did something that the Romans remembered as an example of Caesar's mercy. He ordered that their throats be cut before they were nailed to the crosses, sparing them the long agony that usually accompanied crucifixion. This mercy reveals several important aspects of the Roman attitude toward crucifixion. First, it demonstrates that prolonged suffering was indeed the goal of punishment. Caesar's contemporaries would have considered a quick death a significant concession, proof of his merciful character. Second, It shows how crucifixion could be modified to suit political needs, while retaining its symbolic function. The pirates were still crucified and put on display as a warning to others, but Caesar's reputation as a merciful ruler was enhanced by his willingness to limit their suffering. This story also illustrates the deeply personal nature of crucifixion in Roman culture. It was not impersonal state justice, but personal revenge elevated to the status of public spectacle. Caesar had been wronged, and Roman culture not only allowed but expected him to take proportionate revenge. The crucifixion of the pirates was not simply punishment for their crimes, it was satisfaction for the insult inflicted on a Roman citizen. To understand the true impact of crucifixion, it is necessary to study not only individual executions, but also the systematic use of mass crucifixions as an instrument of imperial policy. The Romans did not simply execute criminals. They created theatrical displays of state power that could influence the behavior of the entire population. The crucifixions following the Spartacus uprising were not unique in Roman history, but merely the most famous example of a widespread practice. Similar mass executions followed other major uprisings throughout the empire's history. After the Jewish revolt of 66-70 CE, the historian Josephus reported that the Romans crucified so many prisoners that there was not enough wood for crosses or space to erect them. According to Josephus, during the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans crucified 500 or more prisoners every day, creating a forest of crosses surrounding. You are walking along the most famous road in the ancient world, the Appian Way, in 71 BC. But instead of admiring Roman engineering, you are confronted with a horrific sight stretching to the horizon. 6,000 crucified men hanging on crosses, their bodies a gruesome testament to the price of disobeying Rome. This was not just execution, it was theater, psychology, and politics, combined into the most brutal spectacle ever devised by the ancient world. Crucifixion was not just a method of execution in ancient Rome. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a carefully orchestrated symphony of suffering designed to break the body and spirit, and serve as an unambiguous warning to all who dared to challenge Roman authority. The Romans did not invent crucifixion, but they perfected it with the same methodical precision they applied to road building and military conquest. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, called it crudelissimum taeterimumque supplicium, the most cruel and abominable punishment. According to the historian Josephus, it was the most horrible of deaths. However, despite all its horror, crucifixion served a purpose that went far beyond simple execution. It was Rome's ultimate instrument of social control, a public demonstration of imperial power that could turn one death into a lesson for thousands. Roman society was built on a rigid hierarchy, and even in death, these distinctions mattered greatly. Crucifixion occupied a special place in this hierarchy of punishments. It was clearly intended for those whom Roman society considered the most worthless and despicable. Roman citizens, regardless of their crimes, were generally protected from this fate by their citizenship, a legal shield that separated them from the masses of slaves, foreigners, and social outcasts who populated the empire. The Lex Julia Divi Publica, passed under Augustus, specifically prohibited the crucifixion of Roman citizens, except in cases of treason. This was not mercy. It was class consciousness enshrined in law. A Roman citizen who committed murder could be executed by beheading or exiled, punishments that preserved a measure of dignity even after death. But a slave who struck his master, a pirate who threatened Roman trade, or a rebel who challenged Roman rule, was subject to crucifixion with all the shame and suffering that it entailed. This legal distinction served several purposes. It reinforced the value of Roman citizenship, making it a privilege worth striving for and defending. It upheld social order by demonstrating the consequences of challenging the established hierarchy. And it preserved the dignity of the ruling class by ensuring that even in punishment, Romans remained separate from and superior to their subjects. The categories of people usually sentenced to crucifixion say a lot about Roman values and fears. Slaves made up the largest group. Their bodies belonged to their masters, and their deaths belonged to the state. They were followed by pirates and bandits, whose crimes against Roman trade and security made them enemies of civilization itself. Special attention was paid to political rebels, especially those who led slave revolts or provincial uprisings, and their public executions served as a warning to others who might harbor similar ambitions. The process of crucifixion was designed to maximize suffering and ensure a slow, public death with complete humiliation of the victim's human dignity. It did not begin with the cross itself, but with preparatory rituals that stripped the victim of all dignity and hope. First, the condemned were subjected to flagellation, a brutal whipping that served both as punishment and practical preparation for what lay ahead. Roman whips were complex instruments of torture, usually consisting of leather straps with pieces of metal, bone, or clay embedded in them. The flagrum taxillatum, the most terrifying version, had lead balls and sharp shards that could tear flesh from bone with each blow. This preliminary torture served several purposes. It weakened the victim, making escape impossible. It began the process of public humiliation, and it often caused such blood loss that it hastened death, preventing the crucifixion from dragging on for several days. After the flogging, there was a forced march to the place of execution, a public procession of shame that turned the entire city into a theater of suffering. The condemned were forced to carry the patibulum, a horizontal crossbar that would soon support their dying bodies. This crossbar usually weighed between 75 and 125 pounds, which was an unbearable burden for a person already weakened by torture and blood loss. The procession followed a predetermined route through the busiest parts of the city to ensure maximum visibility of the upcoming spectacle. Vertical posts, or stumps, were often permanent structures at execution sites, rising like a forest of death on hills outside large cities. When the procession reached its destination, the real horror began. The condemned were stripped naked, and their clothes were distributed to the executioners as traditional payment for their work. This nudity was not merely a practical measure. It was a deliberate assault on human dignity, reducing the condemned to the level of animals before a mocking crowd. The crucifixion process itself varied depending on local customs and the preferences of the commander, but some elements remained the same. The victim was laid on the ground, their arms stretched out along the patibulum and attached to it. Contrary to popular belief, nails were not driven into the palms of the hands, as the flesh in this area could not support the weight of the body. Instead, they were driven into the wrists, between the radius and ulna bones, or into the space between the bones of the forearm, severing nerves and causing excruciating pain that intensified with every movement. The legs presented a particular problem for the executioners. Sometimes they were nailed separately to a vertical post, but more often they were placed one on top of the other and secured with a single long nail through both feet. This position forced the knees to bend slightly, creating a squatting position that made breathing difficult and intensified the victim's suffering. One of the most diabolical innovations in crucifixion technology was the sedile, a small wooden ledge attached to the vertical post that provided minimal support for the victim's body. At first glance, this may seem like an act of mercy, a small concession to human suffering. In fact, it was quite the opposite. It was a calculated intensification of torture that prolonged the agony for days or even weeks. The sedile served several cruel purposes. First, it prevented the victim from dying too quickly from suffocation. Without support, a crucified person would usually die within a few hours, as the weight of their body made breathing impossible. The sedile provided enough support to keep the victim alive, allowing them to rise slightly to take a few shallow breaths, prolonging their suffering indefinitely. This small seat also created terrible psychological torture. It offered hope, the possibility of rest, of relief from constant tension. and at the same time made that relief unattainable. The victim could shift their weight onto the sedile for a few moments, but never long enough to truly rest. The position was too uncomfortable, the pain too intense, the fatigue too overwhelming. Hope turned to torment, mercy turned to cruelty. The physiological effects of prolonged crucifixion were devastating, and this was done intentionally. The position of the body made normal breathing almost impossible, forcing the victim into a cycle of exhausting efforts just to survive. To breathe, they had to push off with their nailed feet and reach with their nailed hands, causing waves of pain to shoot through their already mangled limbs. To exhale, they had to allow their bodies to sag, stretching their wounds and preparing for the next agonizing breath. This cycle could not continue indefinitely. Their muscles quickly tired, and each breath became more difficult. Under the hot Mediterranean sun, dehydration accelerated, and being outdoors brought its own complications. As fluid was lost, the victim's blood pressure dropped, and the stress of constant pain caused a release of hormones that further impaired the body's functioning. When death finally came, it was usually the result of a combination of factors. Asphyxiation was common, as the exhausted muscles could no longer lift the body to breathe. Cardiovascular shock from blood loss and dehydration claimed the lives of others. In some cases, hypothermia or secondary infections from wounds proved fatal. The Romans perfected a method of execution that could kill in several ways, ensuring that death was inevitable and unpredictable. No single event illustrates the role of crucifixion in Roman society better than the mass executions that followed the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BC. This was not simply punishment. It was a carefully planned act of state terror designed to ensure that a slave uprising would never happen again.